Lisa Parker had given her youth to Parker's Diner, the modest roadside restaurant her father once built with pride. When a sudden stroke stole his voice and strength, Lisa abandoned her nursing job in the city and returned to the small town of Millfield. Now she stood behind the counter every day, trying to keep alive not only a business, but a legacy. The diner had grown quiet, the tables too often empty, and the stack of unpaid bills loomed higher each week. At night, in the stillness of her room above the diner, she whispered to herself, "Just hold on a little longer. A few more months. Somehow, things will turn." The old neon sign outside flickered like a weary heartbeat. Sometimes, when Lisa locked the doors at closing, she would lay her hand against the cool glass and imagine her father standing beside her, his laugh echoing, his words reassuring. "Money or no money, everyone who walks in here deserves kindness. Lisa, never forget that." But in the quiet mornings, as she brewed the first pot of coffee and looked out at the empty parking lot, doubt crept in like a shadow. Could one woman's kindness truly keep a dream alive when the world seemed ready to let it die? The bell above the diner door jingled, a sound Lisa had grown to treasure, though lately it was rare. She looked up, expecting one of the few familiar locals. Instead, a man stepped in who seemed carved from another world. His leather jacket was worn, his boots heavy with miles of forgotten highways. A beard shadowed his jaw, and a tattoo curled around the veins of his neck. He moved slowly, like a storm cloud entering a quiet sky. Conversations at the back table stilled. Forks paused in midair. Lisa felt the sudden weight of a dozen eyes fixed on the man. Millfield had never welcomed strangers easily, especially not ones who looked like this, like trouble, like the kind of story people whispered about but never wanted to live through. The man lowered himself onto a stool at the counter. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the faded menu board, hands trembling slightly as though holding back a private war. Lisa's pulse quickened, but she reminded herself of her father's words, "Everyone deserves kindness." She stepped forward, forcing a smile. "What can I get you?" His voice came out rough, like gravel dragged over concrete. "Coffee. Black." As she poured the steaming liquid into a chipped white mug, Lisa noticed his hands, scarred, calloused, yet oddly fragile as they wrapped around the warmth of the cup. He drank deeply, as though it were the first good thing to touch his lips in days. The silence in the diner thickened, but Lisa refused to step back. She watched him with quiet curiosity, and something in her gaze, gentle, unwavering, seemed to reach him. For a brief second, his shoulders eased, the storm in his eyes softening into something almost human. It was in that moment Lisa sensed the truth. This was no ordinary customer. This man carried a story heavy enough to break him, and whether she wanted it or not, Parker's Diner was about to become part of it. By the next morning, whispers had already spread through Millfield like smoke curling under a door. "Did you see him?" Sat right there at Lisa's counter. Biker trash. Dangerous kind. Familiar faces that usually filled the corner booths chose to stay home. The bell above the door was silent. The coffee pot grew cold. Lisa noticed it all. The absence, the shifting glances, the shadow of judgment falling over her little restaurant. Yet when she looked at the empty seats, she also remembered the stranger's trembling hands wrapped around that cup of coffee. She remembered how he seemed, for just a breath, less like a menace and more like a man trying not to fall apart. Still, the words of the town burrowed deep. Doubt is a sly thief. It creeps in with whispers. Alone in the kitchen, Lisa pressed her palms against the counter and whispered to herself, "I only gave him coffee. That's all. Is that really a crime?" Outside. It came sooner than Lisa expected. That evening, just as the sun was sinking and the diner's neon sign flickered to life, the bell above the door rang. Officer Brennan walked in, his uniform pressed sharp, his boots heavy on the tile floor. Behind him trailed two other men, locals Lisa recognized all too well. Men who carried their opinions like weapons, ready to draw them at the first chance. Brennan didn't order coffee. He didn't even look at the menu. He leaned against the counter, folded his arms, and let his voice carry across the empty room. Lisa, I hear you've been making new friends. The words weren't casual, they were bait. Lisa set down the rag she was holding. If you mean the gentleman who came in yesterday, yes. He bought a cup of coffee. That's all. One of the men behind Brennan snorted. Gentleman? You mean that biker trash? Lisa, you don't know what kind of danger you're inviting in here. Heat flushed up Lisa's neck, but she steadied her tone. He paid for his meal. He was respectful. I don't turn away people who come hungry or tired. That's not who we are. Brennan leaned closer, lowering his voice though the edge in it cut sharper than before. This town is small. People talk. And when they talk, businesses live or die. You want to throw your future away on some drifter with a record? Because that's what he is, Lisa. A man who brings nothing but trouble. For a moment, Lisa felt her courage falter. The image of empty tables flashed in her mind, the unpaid bills stacked at home, her father's silent eyes from the nursing home. Could she afford to stand against the tide of her own town? The next morning dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself mirrored Lisa's heart. She had barely unlocked the diner when she saw it, a notice tacked to the front door. Red letters screaming, violation, subject to closure. Her breath caught. Hands trembling, she tore the paper free and read it again, the words burning like fire. It was Brennan's doing. No matter what the world says about them. And I won't betray that. He looked at her for a long time, as though searching her face for any trace of doubt. When he found none, his eyes glistened. He swallowed hard, then whispered, Nobody's ever stood up for me before. Lisa felt her own throat tighten, but she forced a small smile. Then maybe it's time someone did. Outside, the streets of Millfield still hummed with judgment and suspicion. But inside Parker's diner, in that fragile moment, something unshakable was born. The quiet, defiant courage of one woman who refused to bend. The cost revealed itself slowly, like a crack spreading across glass. First, it was the silence. Regulars who once filled the booths each morning began to vanish. Mrs. Henderson no longer came for her pie. The Wilson boys, who used to linger over burgers after school, now passed by without stepping inside. Even the Sunday church crowd. Once the heartbeat of Parker's diner shifted to the cafe 2 streets over. Then came the stares. When Lisa walked through town, conversations hushed. Heads turned. Some people crossed to the other side of the street. Their eyes didn't hold anger so much as disappointment, a quiet accusation that cut deeper than words. She chose him. She chose outsiders over us. And of course, there were the bills. With fewer customers, the register grew light. Lisa found herself counting quarters at night, wondering which utility could wait another week, which supplier might grant her a little more mercy. Each evening, she brewed coffee for herself and sat alone in the dim diner, the hum of the refrigerator her only companion. Yet even in the hollow quiet, Ray returned. Always quietly, always respectfully, never staying longer than a single meal. He left bills on the counter, sometimes more than enough, as if trying to repay debts that couldn't be measured in money. One night, as rain battered the diner windows, Ray lingered after paying. Lisa noticed the way his hands fidgeted, as though fighting to keep something inside. Finally, he spoke. My daughter's in the hospital, he said, voice low, thick with pain. Leukemia. I ride out here between shifts just to breathe. The boycott of Parker's diner might have lasted forever, if not for the day the rumble of engines rolled through Millfield like thunder. It began quietly. Lisa was wiping down the counter when she noticed 2 figures stepping through the door. A man and a woman, middle-aged, carrying the weariness of long miles. They looked out of place in town. Yet their eyes held warmth as they sought her out. Are you Lisa Parker? The woman asked softly. Lisa nodded, cautious. The man stepped forward, offering a calloused hand.
I'm Thomas.
And then, one by one, they entered. 200 strong, boots striking the floor, voices low but respectful. The air filled with leather and steel, but also with something unexpected. But his voice carried kindness. You stood for one of ours when nobody else would. We don't forget things like that. From this day forward, Parker's Diner isn't alone. He laid a thick envelope on the counter. Supplies, food, whatever you need. It's covered. Tears stung Lisa's eyes as the bikers filled every booth, laughter booming. Neighbors who had turned their backs stood frozen on the sidewalks, staring at the impossible, a small-town diner transformed into a sanctuary where strangers became family. For the first time in weeks, Lisa felt the weight lift from her chest. The community that had abandoned her was being replaced by another, a rougher, louder, but fiercely loyal community. The angels had arrived, and with them, a promise. Parker's Diner would never stand alone again. That night, Parker's Diner breathed again. The once empty booths overflowed with life. Leather jackets draped across seats, boots tapping against tile, the low rumble of laughter filling every corner. Plates of burgers and fries slid across counters, mugs of coffee refilled faster than Lisa could pour them. What had been a hollow, silent place only days ago was now bursting with warmth, with belonging. But it wasn't just the food. It was the spirit. The bikers, men and women hardened by the road, scarred by life, treated Parker's Diner as if it were sacred ground. They paid not just for their meals, but for the silence they were breaking, the isolation they were erasing. Tips piled high on tables. Hands clapped Lisa's shoulder, voices rough but sincere. Thank you. For him. For us. And then came the townsfolk. At first, they lingered on the sidewalks, staring through the glowing windows as though afraid to enter. Mothers held their children close. Old men whispered about danger. Yet curiosity has a way of pulling people closer. One boy tugged his mother's hand and said, "I want to see the motorcycles." Within minutes, he was sitting on a chrome seat outside, a burly biker grinning as he lifted the child up. Laughter spilled into the street, and the line between us and them began, slowly, to blur. Inside, a miracle unfolded. A table of bikers slid aside to make room for a young family who dared to step through the door. A waitress from the cafe down the street sneaked in. She shook her head, her own throat tight. "No, Ray." We all did. And in that moment, Parker's Diner was no longer just a small-town restaurant. It was proof that community could be built not from bloodlines or geography, but from the simple, radical act of standing beside another human being when no one else would. Every morning, the rumble of engines announced the return of the angels. Not always hundreds, but always enough to remind Lisa that she was no longer alone. The diner thrummed with laughter, with stories from the road, with the clatter of forks against plates. For every regular the town had lost, 3 new faces appeared, filling the space with life again. And yet, it was what happened outside the diner that struck deepest. Word spread about Ray's daughter, Jessie. She was only 8 years old, pale and fragile, her small body fighting a battle too big for her. When the angels came, they didn't just come to eat. They came with envelopes, with jars filled with bills, with helmets passed around like offering plates. Every man and woman gave what they could. One evening, Lisa watched as Ray stood at the center of the diner, his hands trembling as he held a crumpled envelope so stuffed with cash it barely closed. His voice cracked as he said, Years later, the neon sign above Parker's Diner still flickered against the night, but now it glowed with a different kind of light, one born not just of electricity, but of memory. Lisa stood behind the counter, silver now threaded through her dark hair. The diner was busier than ever, filled not only with townsfolk, but with travelers who had heard the story. Some came for the food, but most came for something else. To sit in a place that had once stood against fear with nothing more than courage and kindness. Ray still came by, though not as often. His daughter, Jessie, had beaten the odds. She grew stronger, her laughter filling the diner each time she visited. Sometimes, she would lean against the counter and say to Lisa, "Dad says you saved me." Lisa would smile, her heart swelling, and answer, "No, sweetheart. You saved all of us." Because it was true. The angels still rode through town every now and then, their engines rolling like thunder, their presence a reminder of that time when the world seemed against them, but they stood together anyway. Even the townsfolk, once so quick to judge, had changed. Some had apologized, some never spoke of the past, but all of them came back, slowly, quietly, humbled by the truth that kindness had built what suspicion tried to tear down. On quiet evenings, Lisa sometimes sat at the booth near the window, watching the sun sink over Millfield. She thought of her father, of the lessons he had whispered into her heart. Everyone deserves kindness, Lisa. Everyone. The diner had outlived storms, rumors, and fear. It had outlived judgment. What remained was something no one could take away, a legacy. Not of food, not of profit, but of humanity. Of what happens when one woman chooses compassion over convenience, when a community learns that strength is not an exclusion but in the courage to open its doors. And so Parker's Diner became more than a restaurant. It became a story passed down like scripture, a living reminder that even the smallest act of kindness can ripple outward, touching lives we may never see. Long after the plates were cleared and the neon light dimmed, the message remained. Kindness is never wasted. It does not vanish. It becomes a legacy.